What would you do if you signed what you thought was a simple land contract, only to discover you'd just agreed to marry a woman who towers 9 feet tall and possesses abilities that defy every law of nature? For Jake Morrison, a struggling real estate agent from Cedar Falls, Iowa, this nightmare became his reality when he stumbled upon the most lucrative deal of his career. But sometimes, the best opportunities come with the deadliest strings attached. What Jake thought would solve all his financial problems would instead thrust him into a world where ancient bloodlines, supernatural powers, and deadly family secrets collide in ways that would challenge everything he believed about reality itself. They say the devil is in the details, but Jake Morrison never bothered reading the fine print. When mysterious billionaire Evelyn Blackthorne offered him $50,000 just to handle the paperwork on a remote Montana property, Jake saw dollar signs, not danger. He had no idea that this seemingly routine transaction would bind him to a woman whose very existence defied explanation, whose family had guarded terrifying secrets for generations, and whose previous husbands had all met mysterious, untimely deaths. As Jake would soon discover, some contracts aren't written in ink but in blood, and breaking them comes with consequences far worse than any lawsuit. The rain hammered against the windows of Jake Morrison's cramped office in Cedar Falls, as he stared at the pile of unpaid bills scattered across his desk, 3 months behind on rent, 2 months behind on his car payment, and his phone buzzing incessantly with calls from creditors he couldn't afford to answer. At 32 years old, Jake had always believed that hard work and determination would eventually pay off, but the real estate market in small-town Iowa had other plans. Properties sat on the market for months. Commissions grew smaller, and dreams of success seemed to slip further away with each passing day. That Tuesday morning started like any other, with Jake nursing his third cup of gas station coffee while scrolling through listings that no one seemed interested in buying. The bell above his office door chimed, and Jake looked up to see a woman unlike anyone he'd ever encountered. She stood at least 6 feet tall, with platinum blonde hair pulled back in an elegant bun, wearing a tailored black coat that probably cost more than Jake's monthly salary. Her pale blue eyes seemed to pierce right through him as she approached his desk with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting exactly what she wanted. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Jake couldn't quite place. "I'm Evelyn Blackthorne. I have a proposition that could solve all your financial difficulties." She placed a thick manila envelope on his desk, and Jake could see the corner of what appeared to be cash peeking out from inside. "I need someone to handle a simple property transaction in Montana. The pay is $50,000, and all you need to do is drive to the location, witness some paperwork being signed, and file the necessary documents with the county clerk." Jake's heart raced as he processed the number she'd mentioned. $50,000 would solve every problem currently keeping him awake at night, with plenty left over to finally take a real vacation. He tried to maintain his composure as he asked about the details, but Evelyn's answers remained frustratingly vague. The property was located in the mountains outside Glacier National Park, she explained, and the transaction involved transferring land that had been in her family for generations. The previous owner had recently passed away, and certain legal formalities needed to be completed quickly to avoid complications with the estate. "Why me?" Jake asked, suspicious of such a generous offer from a complete stranger. "There must be dozens of agents in Montana who could handle this locally." Evelyn's smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she leaned forward slightly. "Let's just say this transaction requires someone with no prior knowledge of the property or its history. Someone who can approach the situation with fresh eyes and no preconceived notions. Your reputation for discretion and professionalism precedes you, Mr. Morrison." Jake had never considered himself particularly discreet or professional, but he wasn't about to correct a potential client offering him more money than he'd made in the past 6 months combined. Against his better judgment, he agreed to take on the assignment. Evelyn provided him with detailed driving directions to a location that wasn't marked on any map, along with specific instructions about when to arrive and what documents to bring. She also handed him an advance payment of $10,000 in cash, promising the remaining $40,000 upon successful completion of the task. The drive from Iowa to northwestern Montana took Jake through some of the most beautiful countryside he'd ever seen, but as he wound his way deeper into the mountains, an unsettling feeling began to settle in his stomach. The roads grew narrower and more isolated, with towering pine trees creating a canopy so thick that very little sunlight reached the ground. His GPS lost signal hours ago, and he was now relying entirely on Evelyn's handwritten directions, which seemed to lead him further and further away from any signs of civilization. When Jake finally reached the coordinates Evelyn had provided, he found himself in a clearing surrounded by ancient trees that seemed to whisper in the wind. At the center of the clearing stood a log cabin that looked like something out of a fairy tale, complete with smoke curling from the chimney and wildflowers growing along the path to the front door. But what caught Jake's attention immediately Was the woman standing on the porch, watching his approach with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and amusement. She was enormous, not just tall, but genuinely massive in a way that seemed to defy biological possibility. Jake estimated her height at somewhere close to 9 feet, with proportions that somehow maintained perfect symmetry despite her incredible size. Her long, auburn hair cascaded over broad shoulders, and her green eyes sparkled with an intelligence that made Jake feel like a specimen under a microscope. She wore a simple white dress that somehow managed to look elegant despite being large enough to serve as a tent for a normal-sized person. "You must be Jake," she said, her voice surprisingly melodious for someone of her stature. "I'm Margaret Blackthorne. Please, come inside. We have much to discuss." Jake's mind reeled as he tried to process what he was seeing. Evelyn had never mentioned that anyone would be living on the property, let alone someone who looked like she belonged in a mythology textbook rather than the Montana wilderness. But the promise of $40,000 helped override his growing concerns, and he followed Margaret into the cabin, ducking slightly to clear the unusually high doorframe. The interior of the cabin was as impressive as its occupant, with furniture scaled to accommodate Margaret's size and artwork that seemed to depict scenes from ancient legends and folklore. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, and the wooden beams overhead were carved with intricate symbols that Jake didn't recognize but somehow found unsettling. Margaret gestured for him to sit in what appeared to be a normal-sized chair, though it looked almost comically small in the context of the room's other furnishings. Evelyn explained that you're here to handle some property paperwork, Margaret said, settling into a chair that creaked ominously under her weight. "But I'm afraid there's been a slight misunderstanding about the nature of the transaction." She reached for a leather-bound folder on the table between them and removed several official-looking documents. "These papers don't transfer ownership of the property, they formalize a marriage contract that has been arranged between our families." Jake's blood ran cold as he stared at the documents Margaret had placed before him. The legal language was dense and archaic, but certain phrases jumped out at him with terrifying clarity. Marriage covenant, binding union, and consummation, required for validation swam before his eyes as he tried to make sense of what he was reading. His name appeared multiple times throughout the contract, along with Margaret's and what looked suspiciously like his own signature at the bottom of each page. "There's been a mistake," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never agreed to marry anyone. I'm here to witness a land deal, nothing more." Margaret's expression grew sympathetic, but her tone remained firm. "I understand your confusion, Jake, but you did agree to this arrangement when you accepted Evelyn's payment. The money you received wasn't a retainer for real estate services. It was a dowry, paid according to the ancient customs of my family. By accepting that payment and traveling to this location, you've legally bound yourself to fulfill the terms of the contract." Jake fumbled for his phone, desperate to call someone who could help him make sense of this insane situation, but the device showed no signal bars. He was completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in the middle of nowhere with a woman who claimed he was now legally obligated to marry her. The rational part of his mind insisted that none of this could possibly be legally binding, but something about Margaret's calm certainty made him wonder if he was dealing with laws and customs that existed far outside the realm of normal jurisprudence. "Look, Margaret," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't know what kind of game this is, but I'm not marrying anyone. I'll return Evelyn's money and find my own way back to Iowa. Whatever family traditions you're talking about, I'm not a part of them." Margaret stood up slowly, her massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to fill the entire room. For the first time since Jake had arrived, he felt a genuine sense of physical intimidation. Not because Margaret appeared threatening, but because her sheer size made him acutely aware of how powerless he would be if she decided to prevent him from leaving. "I'm afraid it's not that simple," she said softly. "The contract you've signed isn't just a legal document, it's bound by forces that are far older and more powerful than any court system. Breaking such an agreement would have consequences that extend far beyond financial penalties." As if to emphasize her point, the cabin suddenly shook as though struck by an earthquake, though Jake could hear no rumbling from underground. The flames in the fireplace flickered and danced in patterns that seemed almost alive, and the carved symbols on the wooden beams began to glow with a faint, otherworldly light. Jake rubbed his eyes, certain that stress and exhaustion were causing hallucinations, but the supernatural phenomena continued to intensify around him. "What's happening?" Jake asked, his voice cracking with barely contained panic. "The covenant is awakening," Margaret explained, as casually as if she were commenting on the weather. "It recognizes that both parties are now present and is preparing to bind us together permanently. We have perhaps an hour before the process becomes irreversible." Jake bolted for the door, but found that his legs felt strangely heavy, as though he were trying to run through thick mud. Each step required tremendous effort, and by the time he reached the cabin's entrance, he was exhausted and gasping for breath. The door handle felt burning hot under his touch, and when he finally managed to pull it open, he was confronted by a wall of what looked like solid darkness stretching across the doorway. "The protective barriers are in place," Margaret said from behind him. "They're designed to keep outsiders from interfering with the ceremony, but they also prevent either of us from leaving until the contract is fulfilled." Jake turned to face her, desperation making his voice higher than usual. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me. How can you want to marry a complete stranger?" Margaret's expression softened, and for a moment, Jake caught a glimpse of something that might have been loneliness in her eyes. "You're right that we don't know each other well, but this arrangement isn't about romance or personal compatibility. My family has been cursed for generations, Jake. We possess abilities and knowledge that most people would consider supernatural, but those gifts come with a terrible price. Every woman in my bloodline grows to tremendous size and gains powers that isolate us from normal human society. We can only break the curse by marrying someone who enters into the covenant willingly, without coercion or deception." "But I was deceived," Jake protested. "Evelyn never told me what I was really agreeing to." "Evelyn told you that accepting her offer would solve all your financial problems," Margaret replied. "She promised you money in exchange for witnessing the signing of important documents. Those statements were completely truthful. The fact that you didn't ask more detailed questions about the nature of the transaction doesn't constitute deception on her part." Jake slumped into the chair, his mind racing as he tried to find some loophole or escape route from this impossible situation. The glowing symbols on the ceiling beams were pulsing faster now, and he could feel a strange energy building in the air around him. Whatever supernatural forces Margaret had described, they were clearly real and growing stronger by the minute. "What happened to your other husbands?" Jake asked, remembering Margaret's earlier reference to the covenant requiring consummation. Margaret's face grew dark, and she looked away toward the fireplace. "The curse affects more than just physical size, Jake. It also influences longevity. Women in my family live for centuries, but our husbands age and die at the normal human rate. I've been married 4 times over the past 200 years, and I've watched each of my husbands grow old and pass away while I remained unchanged." The revelation that Margaret was potentially centuries old should have shocked Jake more than it did. But at this point, supernatural longevity seemed almost mundane compared to everything else he'd learned in the past hour. What disturbed him more was the implication that even if he survived this marriage, he would be condemning himself to spend the rest of his life with someone who would inevitably outlive him by decades or centuries. "There has to be another way," Jake said. "Some other method for breaking your family curse that doesn't involve trapping innocent people in magical contracts." Margaret shook her head sadly. "Believe me, my family has spent generations searching for alternatives. We've consulted with witches, scholars, religious leaders, and anyone else who might have knowledge of such matters. The covenant marriage is the only solution that has ever shown any promise of success." The cabin shook again, more violently this time, and Jake noticed that the furniture around them was beginning to glow with the same ethereal light as the ceiling beams. He could feel power coursing through the air like electricity, making his hair stand on end and his skin tingle with an almost painful intensity. "How much time do we have left?" he asked. "Perhaps 30 minutes, Margaret replied, consulting what looked like an antique pocket watch. "Once the covenant completes its binding process, we'll both be transformed in ways that will make it impossible to separate us. Your life force will become intertwined with mine, granting you extended longevity but also making you dependent on our connection for survival." Jake closed his eyes and tried to think through his limited options rationally. He could continue fighting against forces he didn't understand, likely resulting in some kind of supernatural punishment that Margaret hadn't fully explained. He could accept the marriage and hope that Margaret was telling the truth about breaking the curse, potentially freeing her from centuries of isolation while gaining an extended lifespan for himself. Or he could try to find some middle ground that might satisfy the covenant's requirements without permanently binding him to this strange situation. What exactly would happen if the curse were broken? Jake asked. "Would you return to normal human size?" "According to family legends, yes," Margaret said. "The curse would be lifted not just from me, but from all future generations of Blackthorn women. My descendants would live normal lives, free from the supernatural burden that has plagued our bloodline for so long." Jake opened his eyes and looked at Margaret more carefully, trying to see past her intimidating physical presence to the person underneath. Despite everything that had happened, she had been consistently honest with him about this situation, even when the truth worked against her interests. She could have allowed the covenant to complete its binding process without explaining what was happening, trapping him in ignorance until it was too late to resist. Instead, she had given him enough information to make an informed choice, even though that choice might result in her remaining cursed forever. "If I agree to go through with this," Jake said slowly, "what kind of marriage would we have? Would you expect me to love you, or would this be more like a business arrangement?" Margaret considered the question carefully before responding. "I would hope that affection might grow between us over time, but I understand that genuine love cannot." be forced or manufactured through magical contracts. What I would ask from you is respect, companionship, and a willingness to build a life together based on mutual support rather than romantic passion. The terms she described didn't sound entirely unreasonable, especially considering that Jake's romantic track record consisted primarily of a series of failed relationships with women who had ultimately found him boring or insufficiently ambitious. Margaret, for all her supernatural complications, at least seemed interested in creating a partnership based on honesty and realistic expectations. What about children? Jake asked. Would the curse affect any kids we might have? If the covenant successfully breaks the curse, our children would be completely normal, Margaret said. If it fails, any daughters we have would inherit the family burden. Growing to unusual size and gaining supernatural abilities as they mature, Jake realized that the glowing symbols above them were now pulsing in perfect synchronization, creating a rhythm that seemed to match his heartbeat. The air in the cabin felt thick and charged, like the atmosphere just before a major thunderstorm. Whatever window of opportunity he had for making a decision was rapidly closing. I need you to promise me something, Jake said finally. If I agree to this marriage, you have to swear that you'll never use deception or manipulation to control me. Whatever supernatural abilities you have, I want your word that you'll never use them to influence my thoughts or actions without my explicit consent. Margaret's eyes widened with what appeared to be genuine surprise. You're actually considering going through with this? I'm considering it, Jake admitted, but only if you can guarantee that our relationship will be based on mutual choice, rather than magical coercion. I swear to you, Jake Morrison, Margaret said solemnly, that I will never use my abilities to manipulate or control you in any way. Whatever happens between us will be based on our own free will and honest communication. Jake took a deep breath and stood up, extending his hand toward Margaret. Then I agree to the terms of the covenant. Let's see if we can break this curse and figure out how to build a life together. Margaret's face lit up with an expression of joy and relief so profound that it transformed her entire appearance. When she smiled, Jake realized that she was actually quite beautiful. Despite, or perhaps, because of her unusual proportions, she gently took his offered hand in both of hers, and the moment their skin made contact, the cabin exploded with brilliant white light. Jake felt energy coursing through his body like lightning. But instead of pain, the sensation brought a profound sense of connection and completion. He could suddenly sense Margaret's thoughts and emotions. Not in a way that violated her privacy, but like a constant background awareness of her presence and well-being. The feeling was strange but not unpleasant, like discovering a new sense he'd never known existed. The light gradually faded, and Jake opened his eyes to find that Margaret had shrunk considerably, though she still stood several inches taller than his own 6-foot frame. Her features had become more conventionally human, and the supernatural aura that had surrounded her was now barely detectable. She looked like what she had probably been before the curse took hold, an unusually tall but otherwise normal woman with striking green eyes and beautiful auburn hair. Is it over? Jake asked, still feeling the strange connection between them, humming softly in the back of his mind. I think so, Margaret said, examining her own hands in wonder. I feel, different, lighter, like a weight I'd carried for so long that I'd forgotten it was there, has finally been lifted. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. Jake, I think we actually did it. The curse is broken. The cabin around them had returned to normal as well, with the glowing symbols faded back to ordinary carved wood, and the supernatural energy dissipated entirely. Through the windows, Jake could see that the barrier of darkness had disappeared, leaving only the peaceful Montana wilderness visible in the afternoon sunlight. So, what happens now? Jake asked. Do we just go back to our normal lives and pretend none of this ever happened? Margaret shook her head. The covenant bond between us is permanent, even though the curse has been lifted. We're connected now, in ways that go beyond the legal marriage contract. If you tried to leave and never see me again, the separation would be painful for both of us, possibly even dangerous. Jake nodded, somehow understanding what she meant even before she explained it. He could feel that their life forces were now intertwined, creating a connection that would be difficult or impossible to sever completely. But the bond didn't feel like a prison sentence. Instead, it felt like coming home to a place he'd never known he'd been searching for. Wah, Jake said, looking around the cabin that would apparently be his new home. I guess we'd better start figuring out how to be married to each other. Do you have any hobbies I should know about? Secret talents, embarrassing habits that might drive me crazy over the next few decades. Margaret laughed, a sound like silver bells ringing in the mountain air. I paint landscapes. I collect antique books, and I have an unfortunate tendency to reorganize furniture in the middle of the night when I can't sleep. What about you? I watch too much television. I'm terrible at remembering birthdays, and I snore when I sleep on my back. Jake admitted, but I make excellent pancakes, and I'm reasonably good at fixing things when they break. They stood there, grinning at each other like newlyweds who had just realized they actually liked each other. which Jake supposed was exactly what they were. The situation was still completely insane, and he had no idea how he would explain any of this to his friends and family back in Iowa. But for the first time in months, maybe even years, Jake felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. As the sun began to set over the Montana mountains, Jake Morrison and Margaret Blackthorne sat down at her oversized kitchen table to plan their new life together. Two people bound by ancient magic but determined to build something real and lasting. From the most unlikely of beginnings,